My name is San Bilal. I'm the director of ECDPM, and I'm very happy to welcome you here online and for those in our office. And we came with the ECDPM team en force, since we have a large number of colleagues that have been working on these projects. I've been asked to be very short, so I will be. First, I want to start by thanking the European Commission for the supports, without which we would not have been able to engage in this work at this and do these studies. Um, I really especially like the topic that you have chosen today with the AI for social goods and the strategic choice for Africa, in a sense that, you know, AI is changing all our lives, I think, for everybody, but sometimes we don't pay enough attention to how AI can be also transformative in being more inclusive and bringing people. We quite often talk about the digital gap and the problems that we have, but AI can be, in fact, a force to be more inclusive and to address poverty issues. And in Africa, this is really important. And the second element, perhaps, I would like to stress in my very short remarks is that we, of course, talk about the challenges that Africa is facing in terms of capacities and in terms of access to resources and so on to do this, to take full advantage of AIs. But I would like to stress the fact that in Africa, there is a lot of innovation, there is a lot of appetite. And so we should not think just about how to help Africa, and but it's also to how we can learn from Africa and from these dynamics, and especially I think in the AI sector, it is quite impressive to see these, all the innovations that is coming from there, and that's what also this potential we have to tap on, and also at the European level to learn from. But I've been already too long, so let me turn to Chloe Teven, who is leading our work on digital, and you can tell us a bit what we're doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, San, and thank you everyone for joining today. So I think maybe to give a little bit the other side of the coin to the very optimistic picture that San just mentioned, I think it is also important that we acknowledge that the current model of AI development internationally that we're seeing is very much driven by, by a very small number of people in Silicon Valley, and is sucking in ever more resources in terms of energy, talent, capital, and particularly all of our data. And I think that for Europe and for Africa alike, there is kind of this push to think of different ways of approaching AI development. And so today we will maybe explore a little bit what some of the innovations and the use cases that are being driven from the African continent, but also looking at the room for EU-Africa cooperation, and looking at where there are opportunities to work together, as well as looking a little bit at some of the areas where there might also be tensions or questions in terms of how do we work together and how do we develop AI that really works for our populations on both continents. So I'm going to hand over now to my colleagues who are the real AI experts and who have led this work, in particular Melody Musoni, as well as we're also joined by Filomena Apiko and Katya Sergeyev, who led two of the other case studies, which looked at agriculture, education, and healthcare. I'd also like to acknowledge the work of Daniel Ladini and Admire Mare, who supported two of the use cases, and who are not with us here in the room today, but who give important contributions to the project. So Melody, I'll hand over to you now to present on the use cases before we turn to our excellent panel afterwards.
Hello, everyone. Hi, very good afternoon, everyone. As my colleague has mentioned, we would like to present a project we're working on, specifically on AI for social good. So I worked on the project with my colleagues, Philomena and Katia, and we'll take turns to just give you a brief overview of what the work actually entailed. Just to give you a rundown of the project itself, we titled the project AI for Social Good because our interest was mainly on trying to understand what are the benefits, social and economic benefits of artificial intelligence. And in order to do that, we had to explore what could be the priority areas where we can actually see AI playing a critical role, especially in Africa. So we looked at the African Union Continental AI Strategy, which stresses that there are three areas where we need to focus on when it comes to developing AI use cases, and these areas being agriculture, education, and health. And how we went about doing this project was we tried to engage as many stakeholders who are on the continent as much as possible to learn more about some of the emerging AI use cases within the different sectors. And we thought that centering the discussion, especially on AI use cases, would help to answer some of the questions that we have. There's a lot of discussion around we need to have Africans developing African solutions to solve African problems. So it was through those lens where we're going in, engaging with African stakeholders and international partners to get a better sense of what kind of innovations are being developed on the continent, to the extent to which they're actually addressing some of the problems that Africans have. And of course, in us working on this project, we also had to ask questions: who is doing what, where, and why? So if you see the work that Katia did, she was looking more on, is AI in education specifically for benefiting students, or it's profit driven? So again, if you look at health, all these areas, is it really about social development, or it's mainly about profits that come with it? And of course, throughout the three papers, we really tried to spotlight or to highlight the innovation that is happening in Africa. And I'm happy that San, you have also mentioned the same thing, that there's a lot of innovation that's happening in Africa. The problem is there is no scalability. So there are a lot of pilot projects. There are a lot of potential. There's a lot of potential in the space, but the problem is, how do we scale that? So we're trying to spotlight some of that, those innovations. And when we look at AI for social good, it's not just about benefiting the few, it's about being inclusive. So going through the project, we're also trying to look at how does this technology actually benefit marginalized communities? How does this technology actually benefit underserved communities? So when you have an opportunity to read the work on agriculture, our focus was mainly on smallholder farmers instead of commercial farmers. So there is already a lot of innovation in agriculture generally, which is benefiting commercial farmers. But what about smallholder farmers? So we were trying to go in, looking at some of these issues around inclusion and how this technology actually benefits everyone. And of course, I won't go into much detail looking at some of the barriers for us to get to where we say we have innovation that is inclusive and that's yielding a lot of benefits and results. What are the barriers or challenges that we need to address? And of course, looking at the pathways for Africa and Europe. And before I hand over to my colleague, Philomena, I'll just give you an overview again of the paper we did specifically on AI in agriculture. Again, the focus there was mainly on smallholder farming and for smallholder farmers. Some of the key findings we noticed was there's a lot of AI innovation in the ecosystem, but it's still in early stages. And when it comes to the different use cases, some are gaining more traction than others. So there's a lot of work that is going in, especially on early warning systems. There are a lot of AI researchers working on, for example, on disease outbreak prediction and yield prediction. And of course, a lot of services around farmer advisory services as well, and financial literacy. And within these use cases, what we also found is that there is a lot of interest for food security. So a lot of these use cases are particularly focusing on how to promote food crop production in Africa. And from a regional level, to look at who is doing what and where, we also kind of saw that there is a pattern in terms of the regional hotspots. So when we went in, we're just looking at sub-Saharan Africa in general. But when we started digging deep and trying to talk to different people, we realized that a lot of innovation is actually happening in East Africa, in Kenya, Ambassador, quite represented, Ghana and Uganda. And then, of course, in West Africa, mainly Nigeria, Senegal, and Ghana. And just one interesting fact that came up, I won't be able to go through everything because of time. One interesting fact that also came up was when interviewing the farmers themselves, they said that they really lack trust in some of the climate advisory services, because there have been instances where weather reports or weather forecasts tell them one thing and it doesn't turn out to be the correct information. And because they still uphold traditional beliefs like around rainmaking ceremonies, so they still respect those traditional beliefs. So even if at one point we're told that there's going to be a drought, still they had to carry out these traditional practices and their beliefs. And for us, that was quite interesting, because we're saying if we want to develop policy-driven initiatives, we need to meet the farmer where they are. So culturally, if farmers have these traditions that they have, how does this new technology how can we integrate this new technology into the cultural systems and beliefs? Again, technologically and linguistically, a lot of farmers do not speak English. For example, it's not their primary language. So if we are developing these AI tools, to what extent do we make sure that they reflect their local languages, which is also an important issue. And then, of course, in our recommendations, we're also looking at research and innovation. We need to have research that is contextual to Africa. We need to focus on data that is collected in Africa and representative data sets as well. And of course, through the spirit of partnership, having more and more collaborative developments around that. So that being said, with our work, it might appear that it's very positive and optimistic. There are still challenges and there are still concerns that we need to talk about. But for purposes of a discussion, I won't go into much of that discussion, but just to highlight that even in our paper, we were also trying to signal that there's still exclusion of smallholder farmers. There's still equity gaps in terms of access and benefits that come from some of the AI innovation. And there are also limited opportunities to scale up and some of the new pilots. So I'm going to stop there and hand over to Philo to talk more about the work she did on health. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Melody. Good afternoon, everyone, to those joining us online as well. As Melody mentioned, this project looked at different aspects. So I was, together with Melody, working on the component on health. And I mean, health is vast, right? So we know AI is being touted as this revolutionary tool that can help the healthcare system in different ways. But we chose to focus on diagnostics. Why diagnostics? Because if you look at Africa's disease burden, we not only have a high incidence of infectious diseases, the 3 AIDS, TB, malaria, but we also have a growing incidence of non-communicable diseases, as well as neglected tropical diseases that are endemic on the continent. So we chose to look at this aspect of diagnostics. And just like Melody was speaking about, it's for agriculture, it's a bit emerging. For health, I think there's been a little bit longer use of AI in diagnostics. So our paper really looked at going more towards scalability. What are some of the things that are missing, and looking into the continent to see how are African AI developers engaging with this. So positively, from our study, we found that there are actually developers who are trying to intentionally address the gaps in accessibility. So you find that the AI that is being created, and we spoke to a number of developers, they have what they call Edge AI, which is being used, not necessarily based on the internet connectivity. So they're able to find models that can work outside of internet connectivity by working with the battery inside the device, but then also looking at different ways to power systems, solar energy where there's no electricity. So we found this to be a really good example. However, it's not happening fast enough. So there are good examples, and we saw one, for example, looking at CAD for TB. I'm sure some of you have had this. There's a EU company, Delft Imaging, that is making this, but also African developers who are trying to scale this up. And but we found that overall, it's not been fast enough. So there are still instances where you see gaps in access, especially for rural communities. And another challenge was also that some of these technologies are still quite developed in English, as Melody said. So what does that mean for community workers who actually would be using this with our communities? And just like the issues around agriculture, we also found that in the health sector, there's a myriad of challenges related to scaling of AI. I don't need to tell anybody how sensitive health data is. Nobody would like to have the information publicized. So we looked at issues around regulation. We found that in Africa, there's a paucity of regulation. There's some countries that have started using AI, but no country has a sui generis law like the EU AI Act that actually looks into even medical devices that are using AI, high risk. We don't have that yet, but we have countries that are signaling towards having something like this. We also found data governance issues in place. Most countries don't have health data governance policies, so they rely on the general data governance issues. Some may be outdated, some may not address the sensitivities about health. For example, we found that maybe as a patient, I go and give my data to hospital, but the hospital in the background is giving my same data to a developer. So at what point am I also consenting to that use of my information for AI development? So we also found that this was a gap that needs to be addressed. 2 minutes? Okay. And then, of course, maybe I'll just pick up on the challenges. The one that is specific to health was the issue around verification. So the rest, I think, are quite similar skills and funding, but verification of AI services in health is quite important. How do you check that the AI actually does what it's supposed to do, right? If you're scanning for TB, is it really scanning for TB or is it picking up some other chest infection? And we found that within Africa, the verification, it's not being done systematically. There's no funding for such verification studies, and as well as certification issues. So a lack of trust, as Melody mentioned, comes back. So how do you bridge this? And then, but despite these challenges, we did find that in health actually was quite positive. We found that there were a number of benefits to AI in health. The first, of course, being improving access to diagnostics. We did find that some of the models are actually made to work in the absence of specialized personnel. So there's an example, Baby Checker, that is a sonogram machine. Anyone can learn how to use it. You don't need to have a sonographer or even a gynecologist. So a nurse, a community worker can learn how to use it. We also found, I already spoke about Edge AI. We also found about the issue around efficiencies in detection and referral. So because of AI, people were able to scan a massive number of people. There were examples that were seen in even South African mines and South African prisons, and were able to detect inmates who had TB in time to get medication. And then, of course, the last was improving, and I should not forget, task shifting. We already suffer from a lack of enough medical personnel within the continent. So with AI, you can task shift. A doctor could say, fine, with AI, maybe a nurse or community worker can do the initial scanning and then triage to the medical doctor in case a situation is serious. And the last one would be improving diagnostic accuracy. We found that AI's ability to analyze large amounts of data was really a benefit, and this way was able to support in decision making. But just to emphasize, AI is not to replace human beings. It's rather there to assist them in carrying out their work more efficiently and, most importantly, alleviating the overburdened health systems in most of our African countries. Thank you. So I will hand over to my colleague Katia to present on education. And happy to answer questions afterwards. Thanks.
Thank you, Philomena. So the study on AI in education focused on secondary education and TVET. It analyzed on how the AI system have the potential to transform the education systems in Africa. So the AI in education sector holds a lot of promise, from personalized learning to automation of routine tasks to helping teachers in their task. It can make a real difference. Yet, there are huge data gaps. So there was very little reliable data on, for example, where AI is used, in which kind of schools, in which areas, whether it's public schools or private schools. And this makes evidence-based decision-making incredibly hard. There were, of course, also real risks involved. For example, the AI in education tools process huge amounts of learners' data, and that raises questions of privacy and of data security. Overall, our use cases showed that there is a real ambition in the continent to take advantage of the benefits that AI in education sector can offer. Many of the use cases that we analyzed were focusing on personalized learning opportunities and tutoring and cases like that. Although there were also assistive tools, for example, speech-to-text learning and assisting with people with minority languages and things like that. What we also noticed was a strong presence of private sector in designing and developing the AI tools. We also analyzed some key stakeholders that are in the AI and education space in Africa. The African governments have a central role as regulators, as providers of funding, and of course as providers of policy direction in AI and education space. Furthermore, the investments in infrastructure included digital infrastructure, investments in digital skills and education at large. They set important parameters on what can be actually done in the case of AI in education sector. A second big stakeholder group is representative of learners. This is often student associations, teachers associations, and CSOs working on the area. Their main concern when interviewed were really on user rights, on acknowledging the benefits and trying to reap the benefits, but at the same time being concerned over the privacy issues that were highlighted. Also, for example, teacher associations made a point that AI should not replace humans, AI should not replace the teachers, but actually complement and fit into the curriculum and existing systems. Private sector, as I mentioned, has a big role. It's a driving force of innovation, and in many of the use cases, they were developers of the AI tools. At the same time, some interviewees and some analysts have raised the point of and a concern of prioritizing profits and market success over educational impact. Finally, international actors like EU, UN, donor countries, they are also increasingly getting involved in this space. Beyond improving access and quality of education, international actors, when interviewed, they also pointed out to geopolitical considerations, for example, and potential market opportunities that can raise for companies, for example, in the AI software and data and consultancies. Yes, I'm actually about to stop. So Melody, I will give handout to you for the more cross-cutting topics now.
Thank you so much, Katja. So what we, when you look at the three pieces of work that we did, what we actually found out that there are cross-cutting issues. Of course, when it comes to AI or digital, there is a lot of discussion, especially on the deficit narrative. We have limited advanced computing and infrastructure. So the kind of computing software that is needed and the kind of computing power that is needed to drive AI innovation is actually missing in Africa. We do not have enough data centers on the continent. I mean, some statistics even say that the whole continent has less data centers compared to one country like Switzerland. So there's, in as much as we are talking about AI and innovation, we still need to focus more on how we can build data centers on the continent, how we can also create support, the enabling support that is needed to support AI innovation. And one issue that's also cross-cutting in most regions is the inadequacy or unreliable power supply. So in most countries, if you look at big economies like Nigeria or South Africa, there are always power shortages. And these are Africa's powerhouses when it comes to AI and innovation. So because of that, that is actually a big issue that is also being a setback when it comes to how innovators actually innovate. And then, of course, issues like poor internet connectivity for farmers to be able to use some of these digital tools, for students and learners to be able to use some of these digital schools in digital tools in schools, they need to be connected to the internet. So there's a whole issue around improving on internet connectivity. And again, significantly, data gaps. We cannot have a conversation around artificial intelligence without talking about data. So if you look at in the African context, for example, we really have limited data. The existing data, if it's public data, it's always not up to date. Sometimes it's also of poor quality. So there's need to have more discussion around how can we create our own data and how can we actually train AI tools using data that is generated on the African continent, because there are a lot of discussions around we are tending to import tools that are from other regions that have been trained, or AI models that have been trained on non-African data, which leads to issues around algorithmic bias. So to prevent issues around that, we need to have our own data sets. So being able to also develop our own African data set is a big issue. And then of course, issues around costs of the digital tools and AI tools, and a big issue on skills and capacity to be able to have a digitally literate population, to be able to have data scientists and AI scientists. We need to actually capacitate, and we need to have more and more programs, not just at university level, but from early childhood learning all the way to primary, secondary, and tertiary education as well. And then another cross-cutting issue that came through were the ethical concerns and ethical considerations around AI. If we look at issues around data, for example, who should have access to community data? If data has been generated from a community, who is entitled to have rights to that data and to benefit from the benefits from that data? What about issues on bias, especially algorithmic bias and discrimination that comes with using some of these tools? What kind of ethical frameworks do we need to have in place? And especially the work, when you look at the work that Philo was mentioning on health, that's where it's very sensitive, because we need to take into consideration all these ethical issues around how we use biometric data, how we use sensitive personal information, for example. And of course, positively, throughout Africa, there is definitely political will, which you see reflected in the kind of policies that are now being developed. If you look within the agriculture sector, for example, we now have a lot of policies, not just on agriculture, but they're trying to integrate AI into their agriculture policies. They now have standalone AI policies. I think now we have around 14 African countries that have already adopted their own national AI and data strategies. And at a continental level, like I mentioned, we have the AI continental strategy, which also gives a direction for the continent in terms of how to go about AI development. So you see a lot of political interest and political will to innovate and to support AI innovation. And of course, I'll just end up by saying in Africa, we really benefit because we have a youthful population. They are not just users of these technologies, they are also innovators. And just in my last minute, just to mention also the big part of the project, the 3 pieces of work, we also tried to look at the Europe, EU, Africa angle and the kind of partnerships that exist, and trying to see, now that we are talking about artificial intelligence, do existing partnership agreements or existing initiatives, for example, Team Europe initiatives or initiatives under the Global Gateway, actually address some of these incoming and emerging technologies? And if not, what could be the new entry points to also further strengthen and deepen the partnership that exists between Europe and Africa? And of course, when we look at new strategies like the International Digital Strategy, which is really aimed at boosting European competitiveness through economic and business partnership, what does that actually mean when we look at it from Europe-Africa partnership perspective? Does it mean being able to, for both continents to support each other in building AI factories? Does it mean being able to work together to co-create, to to do joint research projects, for example, and also peer learning. It's not just innovation that is happening in Europe, it's also happening in Africa. So how do we learn from each other, and what kind of technical support do we need to provide each other? So I'm just going to stop here because I know I've run out of time, but thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Melody. And if you want to hear more about Melody's work, we did a podcast, which is online as of this morning. So you can check that out, which explores a little bit more about this project. But I would now like to invite our panelists to join us on the stage. Apologies. So Ambassador Bitange Ndemo, Ambassador of Kenya to the EU and Belgium. We have Koen Hufkens, founder of Blue Green Labs. Dr. Koen Hufkens, Dr. Maya Fjastad. I'm not sure if I've pronounced that correctly, but Policy Officer with the European Commission AI Office. And online we are joined by Dr. Jane Munga, fellow with Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. So thank you all for joining us here today. And thank you, Jane, for joining us online. I hope that you can hear us all well. And I think the presentation gives us, I think, a good basis to start the conversation and to think about some of the issues that we'll explore in this panel. We're going to do 2 short rounds, so please, if we could keep the interventions to 3-4 minutes in each round so that we have some time then to invite the audience to also ask questions, and they can also ask questions to the presenters. So in the first round, I would like to think a little bit about this point about Africa's strategic choices, which I think, you know, is very much present in all of the conversations about AI, that there are these kind of, that there is, as the project has ultimately concluded, there is a need for a great many different resources in order to actually build AI use cases that can be useful to different contexts. And with the AU-EU summit upcoming, I think this is a moment for Africa and Europe to perhaps reflect on what they can do together in this area. So Jane, maybe we could turn to you first. And I'd like to maybe ask you to start by building on what Melody has already touched on in her conclusions. How do you think that African countries can position themselves in the global AI race?
Thank you so much. First, let me first give a congratulations to Melody and her team, and all the authors of the great research. All 3 papers are very helpful, and I think it's really adding good insights on this. So, and of course, thank you for having me here, and also to my, and apologies I couldn't make it to be with you there. I would have loved to be. But jumping to your question, I think there's a lot of ways that countries can position themselves. But I also want to kind of tweak the question and say that countries are already positioning themselves. And this points to some of the research that we've been working on. And we're already beginning to see that African policymakers, stakeholders are very much aware of the strategic positioning in AI. And so they've started to develop policies, which we are seeing as roadmaps, that help them guide how they can position themselves. So I can quickly maybe talk about how they're already envisioning themselves, and then we see what kind of other possible ways that they can do that. So in my 2.5 minutes, I would say that countries have first positioned themselves to ensure that they can benefit from AI and digital technology. So AI is positioned as a tool for socioeconomic good. And secondly, the point that the research talked about, it's not just as a tool for economic good, but being very specific on the areas that AI can benefit. So in our research, we mapped out the different areas that all these AI policies have identified. Real quickly, there are about 15 already published AI policies, and we've seen an upward trend in this. This year, there's about 8 already in draft. So countries already understand there's a priority need. But within these policies, when we do the research on it, we see that there are specific areas from blue economy to health, agriculture, education, justice. There are about 15 of them. But the key ones, I'm glad to note, really aligns to the research that you've done is agriculture, health, and education, and public services. So there's the strategic opportunity to focus on this. And then thirdly, the countries also want to desire to build their AI ecosystems. And I think this is where there's opportunity for many countries, even as we talk about partnerships, is how can then we engage with Africans. Last but not least also is when we build on the enablers, countries have identified the key enablers for AI. And there's not a big varied group like when we see the practical areas of scaling in AI, but there's areas of governance, data, research, innovation, and of course skills, which continues to be a big area for strategic positioning, because you have to really be skilled within this area. So how can African countries position themselves in the global AI race? I think for me is to say they are positioning themselves, but how can they better do this? I think it's how can we best scale up these AI applications. And this is now by ensuring that within all the areas that have been identified by this research, especially those cross-cutting areas of skills, connectivity, and so forth, there's more strategic investments in that. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jane. Ambassador, with the EU-AU summit upcoming in November, shortly after the first African G20 summit in South Africa, what do you see as some of the concrete opportunities for EU-AU cooperation in the area of AI?
Thank you for the question. There's a lot that EU-AU can do in the space. And I want to thank those of you who have been doing inquiry into the three areas, social areas. Indeed, AI can have an impact, especially in Africa. And the inquiries are very good because they lead us to be thinking, what methods are we going to use to be able to deploy AI? But I want to say that the best is that we begin from what problem are we solving? When you know the problem, then you actually go deeper to understand that if I'm going to use it among the people who can't speak English, then we may need to do models that can be able to give them in the language that they need. But I say this because I've been dealing with this for many years. I think AI should be looked at one that would solve the problem of poverty. And then we begin to work backwards to see how can it solve poverty in the area of education, in the area of health, in the area of all these kinds of areas. Right now, what you find is that many studies don't identify any problem, and you touch it and you leave it, you move on, you make conclusions. But truly, AI is going to transform Africa. First is the data aspects. And I'll say this because I went through the same with M-Pesa. People were worried, even learned people were scared of M-Pesa until it was demonstrated to them, this is how you use it. They saw the benefits. You want people to see the benefits of AI, then they want it. When they want it, now you can invest. Then you begin to build the market. But what we do now, the recipient of help doesn't know exactly how to use it. Of course, within a short period of time, they would understand there is productivity improvement in the application of AI. Or those who are using it in rural areas for checking whether the baby is lying well in the stomach. And if not, this baby, the mother can be told to go to the hospital earlier because there will be complications if they try to give birth at home. So that people see the benefits and they demand the benefits. That's what translates into people wanting it and then demand for it, and then it begins to pay for itself. The reason why I'm saying this, Africa should not say, okay, we need money for AI and we need money how to move it forward, how to scale it. It has to get to a point where it generates resources, and that's how you begin to grow. I don't know whether I'm saying this. What I'm trying to say is that we need to theorize this differently. Like Piaget in education, that this, and then people saw the benefits. Now, if we had some new theory, baby steps theory in AI, where we take them through, you check this and they see the outcome, the crop is coming out good, you harvested more, you understand the demand, you understand the value chain because of this, then we don't become dependent forever. And that's why I caution EU, don't come like a mother, come as a partner who would walk away, and then the child is worried that if I don't learn this, I'll miss it. So do I continue or do I continue?
I think maybe we'll come back to this point in the next round. I could
Thanks.
listen to you for the next hour, but I think we might first turn to our other panelists and we'll come back afterwards. So Maya, the EU has been in the process of developing its own strategies on AI and just released the Apply AI strategy, which actually looks at many of these issues in terms of the European market and looks at how to facilitate the integration of AI within Europe and unlock the broader societal benefits. Can you share a little bit more about this approach and how the EU might integrate this approach in its international cooperation? Maybe also taking into account the comments of the ambassador. I think that's a really interesting framing as well. But.
Yes, thank you so much. If I may start by building on the very interesting points raised by Mr. Ambassador, I think this is such an important starting point to not approach this with a patronizing attitude, as you quite rightly underline, and also there's so much to learn from the development in Africa that we can learn and share. It's also underlined by the presenters and the authors. And I think it's so interesting. It's easy to describe AI as a democratizing technology. And there's much in AI that is democratizing. I mean, I'm an old engineer myself, and it was a big hassle to learn how to write source code, right? Now everyone can write source code with just ChatGPT. It's fantastic. You don't even have to have stable electricity to be able to write computer programs. It's amazing. But I also think it's dangerous to think that you underline this, can AI solve poverty? Well, only if we decide that we want it to. And there's nothing automatically democratizing or erasing poverty with AI. We have to make conscious political decisions to do that. And I think that's very well pointed out by you, Your Excellency. And there's also, of course, the problem of data, as underlined also by the authors, that, I mean, of course, there's all these possibilities for democratization, but AI only sees you if you generate data. And the more money you have, the more data you generate, right? If you drive an electric car, you generate more data. Men generate more data than women. And this is also, of course, a well-known risk with AI, but I think we need to underline it again and again. Is the African continent, visible enough to the modern AI model? And the short answer is no. But you pointed the Apply AI strategy, and I think that's actually an interesting starting point for a number of reasons. Well, first of all, it really underlines the public sector, as this interesting report also does. And I'm from the unit at the EU AI office called AI for Societal Good. So it's quite a cheesy name for a unit, but it's also a good name, I think. And the Apply AI strategy also really underlines the use of AI for public good in our international cooperation. I think it's nice to have that put down in writing. And also this report focuses on education, on health, and also on agriculture. And I think it's It's those are we just had a call out from Gen AI in Africa from the AI office on these particularly three aspects, but also on urban transport and urban planning. But it's interesting how much interest there is in this. We had over 200 proposals for this call, currently evaluating, but there's a great need actually to support public sector in Africa, and there's so much innovativeness in these sectors, and that of course has to do, I think, also with other financiers not present in the field anymore, but also that there's so much growth in these sectors and we need more players in the field. Some quick reactions from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maya. So we've touched, I think, quite a bit on the policy level and on kind of the role in terms of how governments and how countries can actually address these topics. But Kun, as a researcher and someone who's really working on developing some of these kind of use cases, I'd be interested to hear a little bit more in terms of how you're approaching these topics, especially the topic of of cooperation between researchers of the two continents, the role for meaningful cooperation in developing also use cases.
Sure, I can put a few words in there. I think it's important to acknowledge equity in this context, especially within academic research. There has been a bit of a history of helicopter science, and I think we're slowly moving away from this. And so I think it's important, again, to underscore, like Ambassador said and speaker before me, that we should foster cooperations which are not cooperations in name only. And like I said, this has historically been somewhat of an issue in academia, I think. And there are opportunities there, and I think long-term research infrastructure is one of those opportunities, because it creates vested interest for both parties to level the playing field and be involved in a constructive way. From my personal perspective, I have a single example which I think is nice. It's not necessarily related to AI, but in the Central Congo Basin, in tropical forest, there has been a tower erected with sensors on it to measure basically how the green lung of Africa, so the tropical forest, responds to climate change. This has been a collaborative effort because people there are involved in the maintenance, in the upkeep of the tower. Local scientists are involved in processing the measurements, but also there is a flow of data back to Europe because part of the funding came from there as well. So I think these are very constructive academic research projects that benefit both parties in equal ways. For AI, I think the development of a local AI tech stack is probably one of those ways to sort of share the benefits of AI development. And then as an extension of that, this will lead to co-creation of knowledge, and obviously knowledge transfer is a key in this whole story. In that sense, EU programs already do their fair share. I mean, you've got EU Horizon, which is open to African partners. You also have the Marie Curie scholarships, who, as far as I know, also provide these opportunities. And these are explicitly aimed at exchange of knowledge between Europe and Africa in general. So, yeah, I think that's sort of my take. Like, keep your focus on equity and see that both parties are well vested in the investment.
Thank you very much, Kun. So I think this is a nice segue actually into this second round of questions, where I really wanted to think about a little bit more about kind of some of the lessons that have already been learned in terms of cooperation, as well as challenges and opportunities in terms of particularly EU-AU cooperation. But in maybe to get that started, I actually was wondering, Jane, if you could tell us a little bit more about your research and your analysis of kind of what has happened in terms of US Africa relations over recent years, and some of the particularly, I guess, what the EU can learn in terms of supporting private sector and engaging and helping to build out the ecosystems in African contexts. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think when you look at the US Africa digital partnerships, there have been varied approaches, and it has really depended on the administration that is in place. And we find ourselves again in a position where that has shifted with now more not aid. We have the disbandment of USAID, and now we are talking more about trade. Previous to that, we had the Biden administration that had the digital transformation with Africa, and then again we had Trump, and then we had Obama. So there's a lot that we can say here what has worked with, but I think it's good to look at holistically some of maybe the key principles that have led to maybe successful partnerships. And I think also to understand that digital partnerships have started evolving more in the front line of foreign policy in the last maybe 4 US administrations. Before that, it was more generally foreign policy, usually on the traditional issues of economic development, conflict, and governance. But now we are seeing very specific foreign policy initiatives on trade, which is great because that means there's a focus and there's a desire for countries to establish relationships in these areas. I think the key areas that we've seen that have been very helpful in the research is when these partnerships are co-created together. And so there's ongoing deliberation and engagements with either at the national level or the regional level. So that collaboration, I think, is extremely important to ensure that what is being designed is demand driven. So there's also coming from strategies that have been developed or government national agendas. And moving then forward to something that we've also begun to see involved, not just even with the US, but globally, is there's a linking of different stakeholders within digital transformation and digital partnerships. And I'm talking about when government is coming to the table with partnerships with its private sector. The US has been doing this a lot. In the last administration with the AI, we saw that the government was beginning to partner together, and even with the current administration, where they're now specifically partnering with the private sector to offer solutions that are trying to meet the demand. And the third thing is also having the financial packages or the financial resources around that. And I think that's somewhere I think that could be strengthened, especially when it comes from the US side, is having the financial instruments that really support this and then can really interlocute with African side and African governments. And the last thing, of course, then is how do you bring all that stakeholder group together to the table with you? To ensure that you're all speaking in one piece. So when government is speaking holistically and working together, I think, and with the private sector and stakeholders, it creates a very strong front for these partnerships. And also when you're engaging with African countries. So we've seen a lot of movement towards that kind of framework. So it's not just government alone, but government also working specifically with private sector and its investment. So, but also this also means that we are also beginning to understand how geopolitics in itself, we can't shy away from that. So these digital partnerships are also trying to frame an AI ecosystem towards what kind of technology and what kind of norms are being framed there. So there are a lot of nuances here that are working towards digital partnerships. But the last one I also want to mention, it's something I think Melody also said in her opening remarks, is when you talk about Africa, it's also very important to understand the nuances of how just different these countries are. When you look at the digital development indicators are very varied. The partnership that will work for Kenya will not work for Senegal or maybe Chad. Also the language barriers. These are some of the issues that we really have to start unpacking in this kind of digital partnerships. Even as I speak here, I'm also telling myself that we need to be very specific, and partnerships need to have that kind of sensitization in how they're interlocuting with different countries or even towards shared goals. So I think I'll stop there and give the rest of the floor. And of course, I have to give a shout out to my ambassador Bitange. It's always good to share the floor with you. He's our representation from Kenya. I'm from Kenya, so good to see you. But of course, with all the other panelists as well. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I guess this kind of emphasizes your point, the fact that we have two Kenyan panelists, but um, that's not to say that there are not many excellent speakers from other parts of the continent, but I think these are some really interesting points in terms of I think also how the EU is now trying to approach partnership and particularly engage its private sector. And I think that it's clear that there is room for much deeper partnerships with specific geographies. I think Kenya in the digital space clearly is one that comes up again and again and again. But I guess part of the framing of this event is also with a view to the fact that there is this EU-AU summit taking place in November, and that that is an opportunity for the two continents, these two multilateral blocs, to meet and potentially come to some common understandings, although I think Ambassador Bitange might have more to say on this as well. So maybe could I go to Ambassador Bitange before coming back to you, Maya, on this point of, of kind of some of the challenges and opportunities, and because I think you had more to say already on this point earlier, so I think it would be good to bring.
Thank you so much. EU Africa, we've come a long way. We understand each other. We are colonized by Europeans. We are still friends. But EU sometimes don't listen to us. I'm supposed to be a diplomat, but but this is not. These are not ambassadors. I say this because, and I started by saying that aid hasn't been good for Africa, because sometimes aid creates dependency. And EU in its wisdom came up with Global Gateway, which is private sector led, which hasn't quite started. It's a strategy that was put in place, and others are seeking for money. There is no money, but Africa is saying, if we are going the private sector way, then we need to change the financial architecture. There is no reason why, even though there are several risks in Africa, that Poland can borrow at 2% and Kenya borrows at 20%. There is no justification. Even if we took the risks in total, we're saying, let's change this financial architecture. We've worked together for many years. We don't want help in terms of aid. It's just that we need fairness in terms of resources. How much can we borrow at? There are several things that people don't understand within the framework of financing. People don't go back to Basel 1, 2, 3, 4 to see how it undermines Africa's financial formation. So you begin to fight that, and you find not everybody understands. So what we are saying is that there is need to change the structure, the architecture of financing. Then the private sector can understand. Those who are doing credit rating for Africa, some of them don't know Kenya borders which country, but they have a big say about how much Kenya should pay by just seeing kids who are demanding a few things on the street. There's a risk, and then this goes up. The other day, I was in town here. The strikers were breaking doors. Should that change the credit rating of Belgium? No, because the people are expressing that is democracy. If EU can understand that, and as we go to the summit, And they say, this is the only thing we want to work on to see prosperity both in Africa, because if Africa is prosperous, Europe will be prosperous because we buy things from Europe. But even with, we are moving, we used to have geopolitics when there was bipolar. Now we're multipolar. Others have seen your weakness, and they are saying, come we do these things. This is the right time to go to Angola and say, we have sorted out this. We are going to make sure that things like subsidies in agricultural, which are undermining Africa, are dealt with. And let us now do business so that we spread AI into the schools, because AI solutions in terms of learning are becoming better and better. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And I think this is something that is at the heart of many of the discussions in Europe at the moment, is also the fact that we need to get to, despite how much our continents are interconnected in so many ways, our history, the diaspora populations, the cultural connections that exist, and the people-to-people connections. Yet, I think when it comes down to it, there is a lack of actually knowing each other, and of our businesses actually having any idea, and particularly when it comes to, say, the digital sector and the potential that might be there for European and African businesses to work together, to create together. I think there's really this lack of knowledge of the opportunities and of the potential. So I think that is something that now more and more embassies, European embassies in Africa, are really trying to facilitate more and more of these trade missions, and to bring the private sector on board. But Maya, let's go back to you, and to maybe to this question of EU-AU cooperation in the AI space, and what do you think are some of the specific challenges and opportunities as we approach the summit and going into the future, of course, as well?
But first, thank you. It's very interesting to listen to your reflections, Mr. Ambassador, and also pointing out sort of the relationship to the private sector and the importance of Global Gateway. If I just add something that I think was very interesting also in this report, is the importance of privacy. And I think we can never, point too much at that. And I think that might be something that European actors sometimes underestimate, actually. But we see in every data breach, especially in health, but also in other sectors, we were set back many, many years in trust. And there's no point in using technology if we don't have the trust. We will never have the data we need if we don't have the trust to use the technology. So I think that's very interestingly pointed out in the report. And you also point at how the data sets are not representative, and that's a continuous issue that we've been addressing, all of us. But I think that's also one of the ways where we need to sort of have a positive spiral, so to say. Another interesting point, I think, is the professions, how we need to mind the professions, and that's also a way of building trust in AI. And even though we can, use triage by AI, we still need to mind our medical doctors, etc. And we also need to sort of get that into a positive loop. And you also mentioned how if I should point at just one opportunity specifically, I think it's actually AI in agriculture in Africa. I see so many inspiring examples, and also well pointed out in this report, where I think European agriculture has a lot to learn from that. You're also touching a little bit on auditing. You mentioned this, like, how can we know that an AI that is supposed to find TB that's actually what it finds? And I think that's also a super interesting point, that to build trust, which will, provide data sets, we also need some sort of AI auditing. Unless we can show that an AI does what it's supposed to do and, doesn't publish the data online, then it's difficult to promote AI in, for example, agriculture. So I think that's a very, very interesting point also made by the authors. Thank you.
And Kun, so again, maybe coming more from the perspective of, and I think maybe it's a good segue from what Maya was saying as well, in terms of, you know, some of the opportunities and challenges that exist when it comes to learning from each other and working together in terms of in developing use cases when it comes to researchers working together. Sorry.
Yeah, so I've got a few notes on this. I think within the context of my research over the past years, I think there are a couple of points. First of all, I think education has been key, or often the lack thereof. And I think this is something that is not constrained to Africa. I mean, this cuts across Europe as well. I mean, technology advances so fast that people, there's a huge skills gap, even across the experts, where, you know, the technology runs away. And I can give a small example from my forestry background. Back in the day, when you wanted to measure a forest, you would do that with a tape measure. And this is absolutely low-level technology. I mean, everyone can handle a tape level measure. But nowadays, this is done with LiDAR. These are digital sensors that you also find on cars. And so handling those sensors, then downloading massive amounts of data, then summarizing that data, and then finally drawing conclusions from that is a vastly different task than dealing with a tape measure and something that is written in a small notebook. And so, with AI, you even step that up again, because it goes a step further. I mean, data sets get larger and larger. So these issues, and the skill gap issue is actually compounding. There is another issue, I think, in that context, and that's technological independence. And I think for me, as a small consultant, small researcher, this is even relevant, because technology is very siloed these days. There are few big companies that actually make up the vast amount of sort of the solutions that are out there. And so you get this fear over vendor lock-in. And so, what is at stake there? Do you want to be invested in something that might at some point come back to bite you financially, geopolitically, as leverage? And so I'm very wary of investing too much in one particular platform. And that's why I always aim for, as a personally as a research, for interoperability and sort of an open source and open science approach, where everything as far as possible is open to be audited and to be reused, easily reused by other researchers wherever they may be. I think that's key, especially within the European African context. Some of the issues that I've seen, and they have been highlighted as well, are the regional differences. So I've worked together with Kenyan partners in East Africa, and so there the technological landscape is well developed, and so things are vastly different than in other places. For example, we have projects in the eastern part of the DRC, and so we had researchers that had to go in hiding because of civil unrest there. So the social economic situations in both cases are vastly different. Also, then what you can expect technology-wise, or what you can reasonably implement towards the future. So that diversity certainly plays up. Now, I'm going to end on a positive note, because this is always a bit down there. So I think there are tons of opportunities there to learn from the past, basically. And I think in Africa, there is the large opportunity to sort of leapfrog into the future and avoid mistakes that have been made. Here in Europe, for example, I mean, if we look at the agriculture and how it has been done over the last 100 years here in Europe, we've seen the use of fertilizer and the overuse of fertilizer, for example. This gives, for us here in Europe now, a nitrogen crisis where we have to manage nitrogen, which has been troubling a number of member states. And so can we avoid this by implementing better agricultural practices? I would say yes, because technically what we are doing now, or what we're researching in Europe, is ways to address this through agroforestry, through sustainable practices with AI tools that look at soil health, et cetera, et cetera. And so basically, you want to avoid these issues, but also then implement the tools that are already underway of being used here in Europe, but particularly then tailored in an African context. I would say there is vast there are vast opportunities there to avoid these mistakes and gain more productivity, more yield, without having to go through those those issues like soil health issues, or the nitrogen crisis. I'm going to keep it with that.
Thank you very much. So we're going to open up to the audience in a moment, including those online. So please do type your questions into the chat if you'd like to pose questions online. Can I get a computer as well so I can see? Thank you very much. But I wanted to ask you one last question, Ambassador Nadebo, because we recently were speaking a little bit more about your research and your thinking about how AI can be applied, particularly in the field of agriculture as well. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about your research and also about how the EU can maybe support these kinds of this kind of work.
Yes, I was talking about combining data analytics and AI. I'll give two quick examples that our productivity, in terms of productivity improvement, we are seeing a lot more happening with AI. But we need to go to the farmers and work backwards from what can sustain them for the whole year, and then teach them backwards that this is what you need to do with your specific piece of land. Many people don't understand that Africa, most of African countries, they are small-scale farmers. Most have like 1 acre, 2 acres. But they still grow maize, which even if Jesus was to sleep next to them, they cannot feed themselves for 2 months. Instead of that, we could now say, for you, you can actually do poultry, and this is how to do it. And this is the assistant which would help you to check every morning and be able to grow 2,000 chicken, which would actually feed them the whole year, and they stop being dependent. The assumption we are having is that AI is going to help farmers and they would think on what to do. They would not do that. That's why I gave you Piaget's theory of learning, that we must work with them and actually use data to tell them that this is what you would need to do, hold their hands. And just 2 seasons, they will know what to do. They will come back and ask, what is it that I can sell? Because as I speak to you, Africa imports $5 billion worth of chicken which you can grow outside your farm. Meaning that they can take advantage of that market by locally producing. Others will do fish, and you tell them that you don't do one small 2 by 2 square meter. That cannot feed you. You have to do this big. Now that is teaching somebody to self-sustain. The farmer knows, understands what they need, understands where the fish will be sold. That's why I said you also tell them the value chains, because the cooperatives which we used to have become problematic. So we can use AI, big data, and build analytics which would give you predictive data that the farmer needs to do that. Right now, the ones you are teaching only think that you can achieve such results if you went to church. Yeah, but you can achieve it anyway.
This kind of points, though, to the maybe the complementarity between the kind of policy approach and the innovation approach, and the need to bring these together better, I guess, as well.
What
in terms of
this is the finding they have done. Now they need to go to get someone to do the value chains and get the models on the mobile to teach them, and you begin to see the results. Don't just leave them that they would find out exactly what to do with AI. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Is there anyone in the room or online who would like to, I wanted to invite Melody maybe to join on the panel, and the other speakers are also in the room, but we don't have enough chairs. But if there are any questions or any points that people in the room or online would like to raise. Sorry, I'm just seeing if there's anything online. Yeah, we would welcome any points. It always takes a while with these things. Yeah.
Thank you, Magdalena. Okay, Magdalena Kropiwnicka with Food and Climate. Compliments on your phenomenal study, and especially on focus on smallholder farmers. I have kind of two questions. One linked, have you looked at all at the potential risks of AI in terms of employment in agriculture, given that around 60% of Africans are directly linked to their livelihoods and are employed in the agricultural sector? And have you at all looked also at risks in terms of at gender, at AI and gender in agriculture specifically, how to avoid risks to make sure that the risks are that the technology does not amplify existing discriminations and inequalities in terms of specifically access and control of natural resources? Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for your questions. So maybe I can start with the question on gender, because when we started working on the project, there was also an interest for us to say, if we look at digital divides, it's usually the women who are at a disadvantage. So going into that project, we're also going in with that focus to say who is digitally excluded. And what we actually found out was that in terms of, I'll start with the side of funding. So there's a lot of funding that is actually going into AI innovation, specifically in agriculture. And some of the calls would also say, we want to encourage female researchers to also participate and to also apply for these opportunities. So when we try to interview the researchers, especially in academia, we found that it's 50-50. So there's still a fair number of women who are represented in agriculture, who are working on some of these projects, which was quite interesting. So from university academia perspective, we saw that it's a 50-50. So I think from the people that we interviewed was 50-50. But then come to the private sector, and people are actually getting funding from other foundations in the private sector. All the people that we interviewed, with the exception of one, they were all men. So it's all the men who are actually doing some of these research. And of course, that question was at the back of our minds to say, if we have innovators who are going into this already, they might be biased, and issues around gender bias can also come up. So it's something that it was at the back of our minds when we're doing this research, but of course we didn't explicitly indicate that in our report, because we're looking at the broader issues that were of interest to us. So that's how we kind of address the issue of gender and some of our findings in as much as that is concerned. And what we also found out in terms of, again, with the age, some of the younger innovators are also mainly female. So I remember we interviewed a female entrepreneur in Nigeria, and she's working in the agri-tech business. And she said because of the digital and a lot of innovation that is happening in the ecosystem, there's a lot of interest, and a lot of young people are also attracted to start farming because of that. So she's able to go to communities and say, well, you can now use drones, you can now use sensors. And for young people, that's really quite exciting for them. And they tend to see a lot of young females also trying to become smallholder farmers. And then the second question was on employment. So with the work that we did, because we're mainly looking at smallholder farmers who are already their own employees, so they kind of have to do the farming on their own. We didn't look at the future of work for that, but I know in terms of the future of work and AI, there's a big conversation around whether AI is actually going to replace a lot of people, and if displace a lot of people and people to lose their jobs. But in agriculture, specifically for smallholder farming, that's very unlikely. Maybe with commercial farmers where you can get to use all these AI-powered devices, tractors, and you name it, then you can see less and less people being employed. But within the smallholder ecosystem, that the chances of people actually losing their jobs are less likely, because I think people are still going to use a lot of manual processes to do the work.
Anyone else on the panel like to come in on this point? Otherwise, we have another question online.
No, I was saying that employment will be disrupted. I mean, it's going to switch to other things. If they won't be doing that, she's right that actual farming is going to continue, but a lot of employment is going to be lost, but it would move to other areas. Those are the other areas we need now to discuss which other area. Is it universal basic income or what and stuff? Yeah.
This is a big discussion in and of itself, I guess, and maybe a little bit beyond today's panel. But I want to take the question online, and then we have another question in the room. We could maybe take the two, but although the question online has several parts. But Munder Kanfir asks, says, thank you for these quality presentations. My question concerns the scope of the public service in the three sectors analyzed. What is the role of the state in the era of AI? And what about data and algorithm sovereignty? So maybe we might turn to Jane online and to Maya.
Thanks for this question. I'll try and take it from a broad perspective on usually what's the role of the state. And I think the first one is, I think the state first needs to promote AI in itself, or the usage of responsible AI. And what do I mean by that? I think the recognition of it through policy, the recognition of it through digital agendas, I think that's key, and how then AI can be used for that. This also means that then the state has to lead from the front by how they either adopt it or how they even position it. I think in adoption, we've seen a lot of applications that are useful for digital government. It's always good to say, what problem are we solving in government? And if it's public service delivery, then how can we use AI to enhance that? How can we be better responsive to our citizens if we better understand their needs through digital technologies? And I think a key one, and it goes maybe to your second part question, is I think another role of the state is always to ensure that the public, the citizens, are protected. And this is either done through regulations, but also having a good judicial system to ensure that there are no harms that are coming from AI. And when they are doing that, there's recourse within the system itself. It's extremely important to solve for issues as child protection and even bias, some of these things, and also make data available. So that would be another role, is ensuring that they're setting up the systems that help provide this. And this also is the key thing, especially if it's going to be sustainable and inclusive. It's also the role of government to ensure that everybody can benefit from AI. And if they do not have access to that, then what are the options for that? So I think there's a broad aspect of how government can do this. I think there's a key role. I think government should lead from the front, and we are beginning to see that those governments that are becoming extremely vocal and driving this, the private sector is also able to come in. So because it helps put the structures in place for other stakeholders to come on board. Is it research, private sector, the funding, and so forth? Because then the enabling ecosystem that is needed becomes one that is anchored in government policy. Again, I think the last thing I would say is goodwill. I think having goodwill and political champions who are speaking about digital, I think is key. And again, I don't want to call Ambassador Bitange out again, but I think we've seen some of the strides that were made in connecting Africa with the landing of the cables. So when there's that kind of goodwill, when policy becomes the policy action, then it really helps with some of these initiatives. If there are any others, I would leave it to the floor, but for me, those would be the initial remarks on what the role of the state. I think the state you meant also government, so I put it in that broad aspect. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. Maybe Maya, would you like to come in? Because I think the EU has quite a strong position on when it comes to these.
It's not
points,
a state,
although it's not a state.
But excellent points made by Jane. Can I just underline that and sort of what did Plato say? We build states with politics and legislation, and the judicial system is, just as pointed out by Jane here, very important prerequisite. And I think it's interesting also distinction made by the question. And is there a distinction between public sector and the state? Sometimes there is, but that's also, of course, different in different states, countries. What is run by the state and what is run by regional actors, but I would maybe point at the need for a predictable regulation and to have a safe system of legislation. And we do find that it feeds innovation, to know what kind of legislation and what kind of regulation will be for a longer period of time. And I also think it's interesting, was also pointed out here before, that several different African countries are developing AI strategies, and African Union is also doing that. And I think that's interesting. We see that in European countries as well as in the European Union, that there's a great demand for having an AI strategy, sort of a description or, someone pointing ahead. And I see that being played out very interestingly in many African countries. Thank you.
The question in the room.
So if I may. Yes, okay, yeah, thank you so much. So my name is Stephanie Arnold, and I'm an advisor at GIZ, and more concretely, I work for the Data Governance in Africa initiative. So very pleased to read that it's a good initiative to promote AI and AI for good in Africa. This being said, I think mine is more of a comment than a question. So first of all, congratulations. I think you've raised really excellent points, and many of the points really resonate with what we try to achieve on a day-to-day basis and what we confront ourselves with on a day-to-day basis. I just want to touch on very few points because I would have plenty. So the first one, the role of governance. I mean, we all agree we need data governance, we need AI governance, but part of our initiative is also, well, what comes next? So once you have the data governance in place, the AI governance, how do you make that policy or that governance aspect come alive, right? So how do you support the system to really then also take advantage of what is being, put in place from the state? And for us, that very concretely means, for instance, tackling also the underrepresentativeness of African data, right, on the global market. How do you make African data more accessible, but also how do you make sure that it's being used, but being used fairly, right, and not being exploited? And this just has so many ramifications when you really concretely try to tackle it. Like, it's a matter of under what terms and conditions do you make data accessible? Well, and not just generally, like under what terms and conditions are individual stakeholders, whether it is a ministry, whether it is a national agency, whether it is a private sector entity, whether it is, I don't know, like a CSO and so on, under what conditions are they willing to make that data accessible? And I think somebody mentioned the fact of data should be open, data should be usable and reusable and so on. And I think in principle we all agree. But when you sit down with different actors holding that data, well, they will tell you that data collection is not free, the maintenance is not free, data cleaning is not free. Well, maintaining the database is not free, so, you know, we're not doing charity. So that's one of the questions that we face on a daily basis, right? Then I had, one other point. Going back, yes, to the data sharing between the private sector and the public sector. So the private sector has a lot of very valuable data, but obviously they don't want to make it accessible for free. But at the same time, you also have the public sector that has very valuable data, perhaps not in the right format and not with the right standards and then the right attributions and, you know, lots of questions around data quality. But then there is also like the question, well, do we want to make that data accessible? And then there will always be questions on what about our data sovereignty? What if our data is just being used and then the profits all go to the private sector, right? Like, because that multinational entity takes all our farmers' data, produces like this fertilizer planner, and then our farmers have to pay for it, right? So then there's the question of where does the value of this go? So I think there are, yeah, just very many questions involved around here. So.
Thank you, Stephanie. I think that it is worthy of a red table its own this topic, and it is one that Melody has been working quite a bit on for the years as well. Question around governance and data sharing, and I think it's something we definitely hope to get back to in the future. I think there's another I could get in the room and just also the panel as well.
Because you also mentioned multiple times how to scale small AI pilots, right? And this is actually the mandate that we have under the Data Governance in Africa initiative. And we were supposed to develop regional pilots. We were supposed to scale up national or smaller pilots to the regional level. And we have very many national use cases in Kenya, actually. I can cite like 5 off the top of my head right now that we supported. And then when choosing which regional use cases to develop, we started from those and said, okay, which ones can we pick and scale to, say, Rwanda, to Tanzania, to, you know, like Uganda. And what it turned out, it's really not that simple. It's extremely complicated. The ecosystems are completely different. The readiness is completely different. There are politics involved. There are, you know, neighboring countries are not just saying, oh yeah, great, it worked in Kenya, now let's copy it in Tanzania. Well, it's really not like that. So it's just very challenging.
I believe even in the EU, this has been quite, there is a data strategy and there's all of this work around building a single data market. But even despite all of this work that has been done, I believe that it's not quite so simple either. So, but maybe we can move on to the gentleman's question.
Hello, I'm Eugene from DRC. Much of my question, first of all, I'm so happy to be here. Much of my question, I think I had answer from the doctor and the ambassador, and thank you. But as I get those answers, I'm just want to ask a question for the ECDMP about your experience, if you have anything about the DRC Congo. If you can, about agriculture and education and your computer and all those things, you have any experience in DRC and the past in your work?
We have colleagues who definitely have worked in DRC, but I'm not sure if you, well, maybe you wanted to also respond on Stephanie's point, yes. But maybe if you can.
Yes, so my experience in DRC is not specifically on AI, it's on a different topic on digital public infrastructure. So if you want to have that conversation, then maybe we can also do so. Yes, so So I wanted to actually react to what Stephanie was talking about when it comes to data and actually having right governance framework to access data. In our research on the paper on agriculture, we spoke to a university professor who is doing research on disease detection. So he went to, I think it's a part of Zambia where they have been affected by locust invasion for years. So he went there and they started collecting as much data as possible with the intention of saying we want to build a tool that will help us to predict locust invasion. And he was saying that the community in that area were the ones who were actually supporting him. So he had sensors in different parts of the region, and the people were going to take recordings every morning with the farmers. And I asked him, like, what was for them the interest in doing that exercise if they were not getting paid? And he said they were actually, when I explained the whole purpose of the project and the fact that it's going to address the problem of locust invasion, everyone was on board because they could actually see the real value or benefit of developing this AI tool. And then I started thinking about it from that data justice perspective to say we have a community who are working together to build data that is going to come up with all these solutions, and someone somewhere will come up with an idea to develop a tool and start selling it to the farmers. What do they get out of it? So it's something that I think in our discussions and going forward, especially on data justice, those are some of the issues that we actually need to think about. How can we actually help communities who have contributed to all the data sets that we are building? How can actually help them to also benefit, and what kind of benefit or what kind of models do we need to have in place? Unfortunately, I don't have the answers to that, but it's something that is also quite real and that's also affecting a lot of people and communities. And the point that you also made on scaling, I think it's also something that came up with even the interviews that we did with Philomena on health. So on agriculture, a lot of startups and small or emerging innovators were complaining that they tend to get like limited funding. So maybe you apply for a specific competition, you are awarded, say, a grant for a year to develop a pilot. The problem is not being able to develop a pilot. It's what happens after the termination of that grant, or what happens after you no longer have funding. So that is one thing that I think from all the startups that we're talking to, they were saying there needs to be frameworks to support some of these innovations. How do we scale them up? It doesn't help that every year or every month we have all these AI competitions, hackathons, people are applying. We are identifying so many AI use cases that are really brilliant and that are really addressing some of the critical challenges that people have. But what do we do if we have identified them? Or what do we do if we have created these pilot projects? So there's that question of definitely sustainability and scaling up of some of these solutions. So those are the remarks I also wanted to make. I don't know if Philo wants to also add to that.
I'm wondering if
Thanks so much, Melody. And I think in the health sector, it was also an interesting factor. How do you integrate these AI solutions into the existing health architecture of the country? Because these are meant to, to ease the access to public health in most cases. So how do you, for example, integrate the card for TB into the state's own TB scanning situations, or even the baby checker into antenatal or prenatal care that the state wants to roll out? And we found that it's not always easy. The cost of interoperability, getting doctors, in the public sector to accept these private sector developments as, something to aid them, not replace them, it takes a lot. So that's also another consideration, the cost related to integration into systems. And Ambassador, I'll hand over to you.
I thought you were asking, are there these AI things in DRC? Is that what you are interested? Yes. I was working on some paper on health and data. or I call it data migration or passive data migration from Africa. Yes, there is a lot of data that is a lot of work in AI and health in DRC, but this is data just like in Kenya and other countries. It just goes out. It just goes. The data goes out, and that is the bigger problem, because if we use it at home, we'll probably find some solutions. And there's one that I want you to see. If you go to the Africa Museum, the first AI model in DRC is actually there. I don't know whether anybody has ever seen it. The traffic one, which was made by some lady from, it is actually in the museum here. You are rewarded. Okay, thank you.
So San, you wanted to?
I just had a question, especially related to the scaling up, and I was wondering, and in Africa there is a growing middle class, so there is a demand, and especially, I was thinking, especially in the field of health and also in education, if an opportunity of scaling up was not to address not the poorest part of the population, because then that's more difficult to finance initially, but to address rather the middle class, then you have the scale. And afterwards, if you then can expand it and then to address the poorer kind of population. So I just wanted to ask my colleagues if you have seen something like that, or in the panel, if you have seen these kind of elements, or on the contrary, the needs are so different and the market so segmented that it would not have any impact.
Yes, so I'll speak again with drawing examples from the agriculture interviews that we had. One of the interviews that we had with colleagues who are in Ghana, they were saying that when they are thinking about developing AI innovation, they are not thinking about the smallholders, because they are thinking about profit, and they are thinking about, okay, if I come up with this pilot, who is likely to buy it? So they're giving examples to say something as simple as a drone. On average, it costs $30 to US dollars to borrow to loan a drone and use it for a day. How many smallholder farmers have that kind of money? And do they even have a need? If you have a 5-hectare farm, do you need a drone for that? Or a 2-acre farm, do you need a drone for that? So they were saying in the work that they are doing and the innovation that they are focused on, it's mainly for commercial use. So targeting specifically commercial farmers. But the other researchers who are, I don't know if I should mention the foundation, but they are also being supported by another foundation. Their interest there is really on, it's not because they are not profit driven, they are really looking at the smallholder farmers, and they are looking at the marginalized communities. So that's why the focus for them is on building large language models that can allow everyone to actually interact or engage with AI tools in their own local languages. For them, it's not about the profit, but rather it's about serving everyone and meeting everyone. But for the majority of them, it's still trying to see if they can make a profit out of it.
I think it's okay to mention the name of the foundation. I think Ambassador Bedungen needs to leave. If you do need to leave, please, thank you very much for your time. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you. We do have a couple of last questions online. I imagine the panelists are quite tired, so but maybe one of those was actually about overcoming language barriers, so that, well, how can non-literate populations like farmers or patients in rural areas still benefit from AI tools? This question comes from Alaji Diallo, data and AI professional based in Geneva. And he has a couple of other questions, which might take a lot of time to address. So maybe this one is also about scaling infrastructure, since AI requires high computational power, are there policies or initiatives in place to support this locally? So maybe if any of the panelists want to address one of these questions. I don't know if Kun or Maya or Jane, if you'd like to come in on one of these questions.
I think that would be a great opportunity for European-African collaboration. Basically, you have the scale in Europe, especially for the training. Inference there, on the other hand, is often relatively cheap. And so, you know, if you can do the training on the European side and transfer the models locally, it addresses some of these issues. I don't think, I mean, there are other ways, and it shouldn't be the only way, but I think, you know, it's a short stop for now, I would say. Yeah.
Thank you. Jane, would you like to come in on this point about computational power, perhaps?
Well, I think what I would say that is there's a lot of initiatives whereby that African research centers are coming together to see how they can come up together with initiatives to have access to compute resources. So I think that initiative is ongoing. And then, but actually I wanted to comment on the issue of the languages. That there's already some initiatives like Masakane, Africa Research Lab, that has come together and is really trying to focus on data sets that are for African languages, especially the underrepresented one. I can actually type the link on the chat for you to look at that, because I think some of these initiatives are becoming very useful when regional centers of AI across the continent are coming together and solve the solutions, homegrown and something that works for them. So these regional ways of looking at it and bringing different institutes to either is it compute or is it in data is extremely helpful for Africa to answer and to resolve some of these questions, besides what other governments are trying to do. But for me, is what I'm encouraged is to see this research-driven initiative that coming up. Thank you.
I believe that was also the initiative that Melody was referring to earlier. But Maya, over to you.
So many interesting questions. Well, I think on the issue of you know, cooperating around computers or AI factories, there are a number of fantastic opportunities. And if we look at the literacy issue, actually that's an issue I think where there's reason to be very optimistic. I'm not always, you know, optimistic about AI, but we see of course so many interesting developments in language and language models. But we do need to work on smaller languages and the need for AI models for smaller languages, and that's also something that Europe share with Africa, right? We're also a continent of many small languages, and I think that we see a very rapid development. And well, none of us need to speak many languages in a year or two, right? Because of this rapid development. Just adding a little bit on Stephanie's question, I think it's very interesting on data, and if we look at like which fields do we need political innovativeness, I think it really is how can we make sure that the value of data is transmitted to the general population, and that's of course a gigantic question, and it's addressed, for example, by last year's Nobel laureate in economics, Darren Acemoglu. But that is something I think that where we really need innovativeness in an organizational level, and we do share that to Europe and Africa, the need for this kind of political innovation. Thank you.
Yes, I could also say, I mean, on data centers, maybe it's also worth mentioning that one of the local rather African companies called Cassava Technologies is also building AI factories in Africa. I think they are targeting to have 5 AI factories in South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, and the other 2 I can't recall. So there is already that drive from the private sector within Africa to actually say to push for data center and pushing for more and more cloud-based solutions. So I think that's one way in which within Africa we are seeing a lot of initiatives coming from specifically the private sector to support the work that to advance our AI innovations as well.
Yeah, maybe I think it's worth mentioning there as well that I think this is, you know, that while Ambassador Nademo earlier kind of alluded to the fact that the Global Gateway hadn't actually delivered so much yet, but I think that there is a lot of work underway now in terms of looking into how can the EU actually begin to invest more in terms of some of this data infrastructure, and there's particularly an initiative called the Digital Investment Facility that has really been looking at how to work with the local ecosystem of data centers in African countries and how to support them in developing bankable projects that then could be that could potentially be funded by the European Union and by some of the European DFIs or public development banks. So I do think that a lot of the work to date has very much been preparatory work, but that the EU really does aim to actually play a role in this area as well, and to partner with African countries in terms of delivering that compute power as well. But I think our panelists have been are probably a little tired at this stage. That was a long panel, Maya, as you pointed out earlier. But thank you to everyone, both in the room and online, who's joined us, and particularly thank you very much to our panelists. We really appreciate you taking the time and sharing your thoughts with us.